The Intersystem Collegiate Academy floated in a stable orbit around Sentinel Prime, a carefully engineered paradise world where the gravity was a comfortable 0.7 g. The atmosphere was filtered through 17 different purification systems, and the most dangerous predator on the entire planet was a herbivorous tree dweller that occasionally startled people by dropping fruit. It was, by every measurable standard, the perfect place to educate the sons and daughters of the galaxy's elite. The architects had designed it that way on purpose. After all, when your student body included species that could die from excessive pollen counts, sudden temperature changes of more than 5 degrees, or, gods forbid, slightly acidic rain, you didn't take chances with the real estate. The Academy accepted students from 473 different species across the known galaxy, each one carefully vetted, their homeworlds assessed for compatibility with the delicate social ecosystem that was higher education among the stars. Most of these species came from what the Galactic Census Bureau officially termed Type 1 or Type 2 worlds, places where life had evolved in reasonable environments without too many mass extinctions, predator-prey arms races, or catastrophic geological events. Safe worlds, civilized worlds, worlds where survival of the fittest had been more of a gentle suggestion than a blood-soaked commandment. Then there was Earth. Earth, that horrible spinning ball of death and chaos in some backwater arm of the galaxy, where everything was trying to kill everything else at all times. Where the dominant species had climbed to the top of the food chain not through natural armor or venom or size, but through sheer stubborn refusal to die, combined with an alarming talent for making things that killed other things. Earth, which was classified as a Type 9 Deathworld, a rating that had required the Galactic Census Bureau to create a new category, because their scale only went to 7, and that somehow wasn't sufficient. Earth, which was technically still under a soft quarantine because the last time they'd done a full survey, 3 researchers had died from what the humans casually called a bee sting. The Academy had exactly 1 human student. Her name doesn't matter for this story, not really, because names have power, and the galaxy was about to learn that some names were best left unspoken. What mattered was that she was 19 standard years old, which was actually kind of young for a human to be off-world, but ancient by the standards of species that reached full maturity at 12. She was studying xenobiology with a minor in comparative literature, maintained a 3.7 GPA, and had a work-study job at the campus library where she shelved books and tried very hard not to accidentally break things. She drank too much caffeine, a substance that was classified as a restricted stimulant for 70% of the student body. She jogged every morning at a pace that would constitute a sprint for most species. She smiled a lot, with those predator teeth that sat right in the front of her mouth where everyone could see them. The other students were terrified of her. Not obviously, of course. This was an institution of higher learning, and the students here prided themselves on their sophistication and cultural sensitivity. They didn't run screaming when she walked into a classroom, though some of the Illithern students, whose ancestors had been prey animals, did unconsciously position themselves near exits. They didn't refuse to work with her on group projects, though they did tend to volunteer for the research portions rather than any activity that required close physical proximity. They were very polite, very correct, very careful never to startle her or make sudden movements in her direction. She pretended not to notice, bless her heart, and went about her student life with a kind of determined cheerfulness that suggested she was either oblivious to the social dynamics or had decided to ignore them completely. Probably the latter. Deathworld survivors didn't get to be oblivious about much. On this particular day, a Thursday by the Academy's standardized calendar system, though that meant nothing to most of the species present. She'd attended her morning lecture on xenobotanical adaptation strategies, eaten lunch alone in the corner of the dining hall where she always sat, attended an afternoon seminar on post-colonial narratives in frontier literature, and was now heading to the library for her evening shift. It was all very normal, very routine, very safe. She had no idea that she'd been marked. The hunting party called themselves the Apex Collective, because of course they did. Rich kids from rich families on rich worlds always gave themselves dramatic names when they decided to play at being dangerous. There were 5 of them, all male by their species definitions, all in their early 20s, all absolutely convinced of their own superiority in every way that mattered. They came from 3 different species, but they shared the common bonds of too much money, too little supervision, and the kind of boredom that came from never having to struggle for anything in their entire lives. The leader, if such a group could be said to have a leader rather than just a loudest member, was named Ketherick Voss. He was Zentari, a species that looked somewhat like someone had decided to make an elf but give up halfway through and add scales. His family owned a controlling interest in a mining consortium that operated across 7 systems. He'd been hunting since he was young, starting with small game on preserved worlds and working his way up to more challenging prey on controlled safari planets. He'd killed a Thorian ridge beast at 16, which was considered quite the accomplishment, even though the beast had been sedated, tagged, and released specifically for hunters to kill. His trophy room had 43 heads mounted on the walls, each one representing something large and impressive that he'd shot from a safe distance with guided ammunition. He was, by the standards of Type 1 worlds, an apex predator. By the standards of Earth, he was prey that had gotten cocky. The idea had come to him 3 weeks ago, during a particularly dull lecture on economic systems that he hadn't really been attending. He'd been browsing through his datapad, looking at hunting forums and bragging posts, when he stumbled across a discussion thread about Deathworld species. Someone had posted a joking comment about how a real hunter would go after a human. And while most of the responses had been dismissive or horrified, Ketherick had felt something click in his mind. A human, an actual, genuine Deathworld predator. Not some engineered challenge beast on a safari world, not some animal that had been tagged and tracked and half-tamed before the hunt even began, but real danger, real prestige. The kind of kill that would make every other hunter shut up and respect him, that would prove once and for all that he was the best. The fact that hunting sentient beings was incredibly illegal didn't bother him much. Laws were for people who couldn't afford good lawyers. The fact that humans were supposedly dangerous didn't bother him either. They couldn't be that dangerous. They didn't have claws, they didn't have armor, they didn't have venom or natural weapons. They were soft and small and walked around without any visible defenses. How threatening could they really be? He'd spent 2 weeks planning, another week acquiring the necessary equipment through channels that didn't ask too many questions. Stun nets, paralytic gas grenades, a neural disruptor that would shut down higher brain functions without technically killing. All illegal and all very expensive, and all designed for taking down large, dangerous prey. He'd recruited 4 friends, not because he needed the help, but because having witnesses made the achievement more real. They'd studied the human schedule, identified the perfect ambush point, and waited for the right day. Today was the right day. The library's 3rd sublevel was rarely used, especially in the evenings. It housed physical archives that most students accessed digitally anyway. Rows and rows of storage containers in a space that was climate-controlled for preservation rather than comfort. The human cut through there every Thursday evening, a shortcut from the main campus to the residential wings that saved her approximately 4 minutes of walking. She was a creature of habit, they'd learned. Humans were pattern-based survivors, preferring known routes and established routines. That predictability was going to get her killed or captured. They hadn't quite decided which yet. Ketherick and his friends positioned themselves in the archives, spreading out along the path she'd take, weapons ready, recording equipment active, because of course they were going to record this, communicators set to silent mode. They waited, and the wait felt electric, felt alive, felt like the moment before a storm breaks. She arrived right on schedule, pushing through the access door with her student ID, datapad in one hand and a coffee thermos in the other. She was humming something, some human tune that meant nothing to anyone else, her footsteps echoing slightly in the empty space. She looked relaxed, unaware, vulnerable. Ketherick stepped out from behind a storage rack, neural disruptor raised, his friends emerging from their own positions to surround her. The trap was sprung. Perfect execution. She stopped walking and looked at them, head tilted slightly in that way humans did when they were confused. Her eyes moved from one to another, counting, assessing, not showing fear yet, but that would come. That always came. "Can I help you guys with something?" Her voice was calm, slightly puzzled, like she'd walked into the wrong classroom rather than an ambush. "This area is supposed to be closed to general students after 6. "We're not here for the archives," Ketherick said, and he put as much menace as he could into his voice, the tone he'd practiced for exactly this kind of moment. "We're here for you, human. Do you know what you are? You're an apex predator from a Deathworld. You're dangerous. You're prey worthy of hunters like us." He'd expected fear, maybe anger, perhaps a flight response, though they'd blocked the exits. What he got was a long, silent stare, and then something changed in her expression. Not fear, something else. Something that made his instincts, buried deep under generations of civilized living, suddenly scream that he'd made a terrible mistake. "Oh," she said quietly. "Oh, you absolute idiots." Then she moved. Humans don't look fast when they're walking around campus, being polite, pretending to be civilized. They slouch, they shuffle, they move with a casual laziness that suggests they're not really optimized for motion. It's a lie. Every bit of it is a lie. When a human decides to move with purpose, when the threat response kicks in and the adrenaline hits, and millions of years of evolution scream survive, they stop pretending to be slow. She dropped the thermos and datapad, not setting them down, but just releasing them, because objects didn't matter when survival was on the line. She covered the 3 meters between herself and Ketherick before his finger even reached the trigger of the neural disruptor, her hand snapping out to grab the weapon and twist it away with a motion that broke 2 of his fingers with audible cracks. He opened his mouth to scream, and her other hand was there, palm striking his throat in a blow that crushed his windpipe and dropped him to the floor, choking, gasping, suddenly, very much not the apex anything. The whole thing took less than 2 seconds. The other hunters stood frozen, brains trying to process what their eyes had just seen, bodies not yet caught, up to the danger. One of them, a Helvian named Taurus, who'd been holding a stun net launcher, finally started to raise his weapon. She was already moving, closing the distance with long strides, and when he fired the net, she wasn't where he was aiming anymore. The net spread out through empty air while she came in from the side, grabbed his arm, and used his own momentum to slam him face first into a storage container hard enough to dent the metal. He slumped down, unconscious or dead. It was hard to tell, and she didn't bother checking. 2 down, 3 to go. 10 seconds elapsed. The remaining hunters finally unstuck themselves from their shock, Training and instinct kicking in, weapons coming up, coordinating like they'd practiced. They were hunters. They knew how to work together, how to corner prey, how to use numbers and positioning to their advantage. They spread out, creating crossfire angles, one of them triggering a paralytic gas grenade that began spewing its contents into the air. She ran toward the gas, not away, which wasn't what they expected. Humans had this thing about poison. They were supposed to fear it. It was one of the few threats that worked reliably across species. But she'd grown up on a world where everything was poisonous to some degree, where the plants wanted to kill you and the animals wanted to kill you, and sometimes the weather wanted to kill you. And her species had responded to that environment by developing an immune system that treated toxins like a personal challenge. The paralytic gas made her eyes water and her throat burn, but it didn't stop her, didn't even slow her, just made her angry. The hunter who'd thrown the grenade, a Zentarai like Kethric named Deleus, had exactly 1 moment to realize that the gas wasn't working before she grabbed a datapad from a nearby desk and threw it like a discus. It caught him in the temple with enough force to snap his neck sideways. He went down hard. 3 down. 15 seconds. The last 2 hunters were backing away now, weapons up, firing. But they were using stun settings because they'd wanted to capture a trophy, not commit murder. And stun settings needed time to take effect, needed accumulated charge to overwhelm a nervous system. She tanked the hits, muscles locking and spasming from the electrical discharge, but her momentum carried her forward anyway. And then she was in range, and her fists were swinging, and humans had been punching each other for sport and survival since before they discovered fire. The 4th hunter took a hit to the solar plexus that stopped his heart for 3 full seconds. Then a knee to the face as he doubled over that shattered his nasal structure and sent bone fragments into his brain. The 5th and final hunter, the youngest at just 21, dropped his weapon and tried to run. She caught him from behind, arm wrapping around his neck in a chokehold that cut off blood flow to his brain, and held it there while he struggled and thrashed and weakened and finally went limp. She held the choke for another 30 seconds, just to be sure, then let the body drop. 28 seconds from start to finish. 5 trained hunters with military-grade weapons, disabled and killed. She stood there in the middle of the carnage, breathing hard, heart rate somewhere around 160 beats per minute, which was honestly pretty calm for a human in combat, and took stock of the situation. This was, she reflected, not ideal. The adrenaline was already starting to fade, her brain shifting from survival mode to problem-solving mode. And she could feel the familiar post-fight clarity settling in. She'd killed 5 people. Well, technically 4 people, and left 1 critically injured. Though Kethric had stopped making gurgling sounds a few seconds ago, so maybe it was 5 people. They'd tried to kill her first, which mattered from a moral standpoint, but probably wouldn't matter much from a legal standpoint, given that they were rich and she was the scary Deathworld alien. She needed to fix this. Quickly, thoroughly, permanently. Humans were good at cleaning up messes. They'd spent millennia figuring out how to hide evidence of their activities from each other, from prey, from predators, from rivals. It was practically a survival skill at this point. And while the galaxy had technology that Earth didn't, that technology ran on principles that weren't so different from Earth technology, and she'd been living here long enough to understand the systems. First things first, the bodies. The Academy's archives were climate-controlled, which meant the air circulation system was independent from the main campus. The storage containers around her held physical media that needed specific preservation conditions, which meant they were essentially airtight when sealed. She started dragging bodies, which was exhausting because these guys were not light, and she was running on adrenaline crash at this point, shoving them into the largest containers she could find, cramming them in there with their weapons and equipment. The containers had digital locks, but digital locks could be hacked, especially by someone who'd spent 2 years working in the library and had way more access to systems than a student worker probably should. She sealed the containers, set the preservation protocols to maximum cold, the kind of cold that was meant for sensitive biological samples that needed to stay frozen for decades. The bodies would freeze solid within an hour, and frozen bodies didn't decompose, didn't smell, didn't attract attention. They'd effectively be in cryogenic storage, lost among thousands of other archived materials in a sub-level that almost nobody visited. Next, the blood. There wasn't as much as you'd expect, which was good. Most of the damage had been internal, blunt force trauma rather than cuts or punctures. But there were some smears on the floor, some splatter on the storage containers, enough to flag on any serious forensic scan. She found the cleaning supply closet, because every library had one, and pulled out the industrial sterilizers that the janitorial staff used for sanitizing study areas. The stuff was designed to break down biological contaminants at a molecular level, because you really didn't want cross-species bacterial infections in a place where 400 different biologies mixed. She sprayed down every surface that might have traces, scrubbed them clean, then sprayed them again for good measure. The air was next. The paralytic gas had mostly dispersed, but there might be traces that a sensor could pick up. She triggered a manual ventilation cycle, forcing the entire sub-level's atmosphere to recycle through filters 3 times. The system complained about the energy usage, but it complied. Then there was the digital evidence, which was trickier. Security cameras covered most of the academy, including the archives. But the coverage wasn't as thorough as people assumed because budget allocations and privacy concerns and the simple fact that nobody really expected violence at an academic institution. She pulled up her datapad, accessing the library systems with her worker credentials, and started navigating to the security feeds. The Academy's network security was decent, but not great. Because again, nobody expected someone to hack the library archives. She found the footage from the last hour, downloaded it to her personal storage, then corrupted the originals with a script that made it look like a standard data error, the kind that happened sometimes with older systems. While that script ran, she checked for other recording devices. The hunters had brought their own equipment, multiple cameras and mics scattered around the ambush site to capture their glorious victory. She found them all, smashed them thoroughly, scattered the pieces into different recycling bins across 3 different floors. The data they'd already captured had probably been uploading to remote storage, but that would be on personal servers, private accounts, nothing connected to the Academy's official systems. When the hunters went missing, nobody would know where to look for that data. And even if they found it eventually, by then the official investigation would be closed. She worked methodically, brain running through checklists, making sure nothing was forgotten. Her clothes had some blood on them, not much, but enough. She stripped them off, stuffed them into a container bound for hazardous waste disposal, the kind that got incinerated rather than recycled. The library kept spare janitorial uniforms in the supply closet for emergencies, and while they didn't fit perfectly, they were close enough. She'd change into her regular clothes when she got back to her dorm. 2 hours after the ambush, the archives looked pristine. Clean floors, organized containers, proper air quality, nothing on the cameras, nothing to suggest that anything had happened here except some routine maintenance. She did one final walk through, eyes scanning for anything out of place, and found nothing. It was perfect. She grabbed her datapad and thermos from where she'd dropped them, both miraculously intact. and headed for the exit. Her hands were shaking slightly, after effects of adrenaline and stress, but she kept her breathing steady, her expression neutral. Just another evening shift at the library. Nothing interesting happened. Nothing at all. The walk back to the residential wings took 6 minutes, and she passed 4 other students on the way, 2 Illithern and 2 Kelvorians, none of whom gave her more than a nervous glance. She smiled at them, that friendly human smile that showed all her teeth, and they hurried past. Normal. Everything was normal. Her roommate, a Valesian named Kiera, who communicated mostly through color changes in her skin, was in their shared dorm when she arrived. Kiera flashed a pattern of greeting colors, then paused, shifting to a concerned yellow-orange that meant she'd detected something wrong. Valesians had excellent chemical sensors, could read pheromones and stress hormones in the air. "Rough study session," the human said casually, heading for the shower. "Professor Kellendor really grilled us on the midterm material." Kiera flashed sympathetic blues and returned to her own work. The explanation was accepted without question because it was perfectly normal, perfectly believable, exactly the kind of thing a student would say after a stressful evening. The shower was long and very hot, because hot water soothed aching muscles and washed away any remaining traces of evidence. She stood under the spray and let herself shake. Let the fear and adrenaline and post-violence crash work through her system in private, where nobody could see. She'd killed 5 people tonight. They'd tried to kill her first, had hunted her for sport like she was an animal. But that didn't make the weight of it disappear. Humans were social creatures, pack animals, and killing members of other tribes still triggered deep psychological responses, even when it was justified. But she'd also survived, which was the point of every evolutionary adaptation her species had ever developed. She'd survived, and she'd made sure there would be no consequences for that survival. And now she could go back to being a student who studied xenobiology and worked at the library and drank too much coffee. She dried off, changed into sleep clothes, and climbed into bed. Kiera had turned the lights to night mode, her skin displaying gentle purple patterns that meant she was settling down for rest. Everything was normal. Everything was fine. The human closed her eyes and went to sleep. The Academy's security office received the missing persons report 37 hours later. 5 students, all wealthy, all from prominent families, hadn't been seen since Thursday evening. Their dorm rooms were empty, their datapads weren't responding. To pings, their last known locations were scattered across campus with no clear pattern. The families were worried, which was understandable, and they had the kind of money and influence that made their worries the Academy's top priority. Chief Security Officer Vralith, a Kelvorian with 40 years of experience and exactly 0 patience for rich kids causing problems, launched a full investigation. Campus-wide sensor sweeps, interviews with every student who might have seen something, forensic analysis of the missing students' digital footprints, physical searches of every location they'd been known to frequent. The works. They found nothing. The sensor sweeps detected no anomalies beyond standard background radiation and some trace chemicals from laboratory work. The interviews produced no useful information because the 5 had been relatively isolated in their social sphere. And the few students who'd known them couldn't say much beyond that they'd seemed normal on Thursday. The digital forensics showed the missing students had all been active on their personal devices until approximately 1847 on Thursday evening, at which point all 5 devices had gone dark simultaneously, which suggested either a coordinated shutdown or some kind of signal interference. The physical searches turned up nothing. They checked the dorms, the classrooms, The recreational facilities, the dining halls, the libraries, everywhere. One team even searched the archive's sub-level where the human girl worked, going through rows of storage containers, checking for any sign of disturbance. They found everything in perfect order. Climate controls functioning normally. No evidence that anyone had been there, except authorized personnel. The investigation interviewed the human on day 3. Routine questioning since she worked in one of the last locations the missing students had been detected near. Vrelith conducted the interview personally, more out of curiosity than suspicion. She dealt with humans before, back when she'd worked security on a mixed-species station near the border worlds. Dangerous creatures, humans, but usually honest about it. The girl sat in the interview room looking tired and slightly worried, which was exactly what an innocent student would look like when questioned by security. She answered every question directly, made appropriate eye contact, showed no signs of deception or stress beyond normal nervousness. Had she seen the missing students on Thursday evening? No, her shift had been quiet, just routine shelving and database maintenance. Had she noticed anything unusual in the archives? No, everything had been normal. She'd actually run a full systems check that evening and everything was functioning perfectly. Did she know the missing students? Not really. She might have seen them around campus, but they weren't in any of her classes, and she didn't socialize much. Vrelith watched her carefully, looking for tells, for micro-expressions, for anything that suggested hidden knowledge. The girl met her gaze calmly, blinked at normal intervals, kept her hands relaxed and open. Either she was telling the truth or she was an excellent liar. Probably the former. What reason would a human student have to harm rich kids from prominent families? No motive, no connection, no opportunity, really. If you think of anything else, contact us immediately, Vrelith said, closing the interview. Even small details might be important. Of course, the girl said, nodding earnestly. I hope they're okay. It's scary thinking about students just disappearing like that. She left the security office, returned to her normal routine, and the investigation continued without her. By the end of week 2, the Academy administration was getting pressure from the families to involve outside authorities, possibly even galactic security depending on how much money got thrown at the problem. But outside authorities meant admitting that the Academy had lost track of 5 students, which was terrible for the institution's reputation. And until they had actual evidence of a crime, they couldn't justify that level of response. The official conclusion, delivered in a carefully worded report that took 3 lawyers to draft, was that the 5 students had likely left campus voluntarily for reasons unknown, possibly some kind of prank or adventure that had gone wrong. Their devices had been deactivated intentionally to avoid tracking. Their disappearance had been coordinated, and while their current location was unknown, there was no evidence of foul play on Academy grounds. The families didn't believe it. But without evidence to the contrary, there wasn't much they could do except hire private investigators and wait. The Academy increased security patrols, installed additional sensors in remote areas, and sent out a campus-wide message reminding students about safety protocols and the buddy system. Life continued. Classes proceeded. New students arrived for the spring term, unaware that anything unusual had happened. And the missing 5 became a campus legend. A mystery story that students whispered about in study groups and late-night conversations. The human girl continued her studies, maintained her GPA, worked her library shifts, and drank too much coffee. She jogged every morning, ate lunch in her usual corner, attended her classes, and smiled with those predator teeth at anyone who made eye contact. The other students continued to be quietly terrified of her. But that was normal. That had always been normal, and nobody connected her to the disappearance, because why would they? She was just a student from Earth, trying to get an education, trying to fit in. The containers in the archive's sub-level maintained their climate-controlled preservation protocols, running quietly and efficiently. Their contents frozen solid at -40 degrees, biologically inert, effectively invisible among thousands of other archived materials that nobody accessed or cared about. The cleaning staff checked the area once a week, found everything in order, and moved on. The security patrols did their sweeps, scanned for anomalies, detected nothing unusual. Time passed, and the galaxy moved on. Because the galaxy was big, and individuals were small, and 5 missing rich kids were a tragedy for their families, but barely a footnote in the grand scheme of things. 3 months later, during an exam review session, a Helvian student made the mistake of sitting too close to the human. Startled when she turned suddenly and blurted out the question that everyone wondered but nobody asked. "How are you not more dangerous? You're from a Deathworld, but you're so calm all the time. Doesn't it bother you being around a soft prey species?" The human had smiled, that same friendly smile she always used, and said something that became another campus legend in its own way. The thing about being from a death world is that you learn very early how to control yourself. We're only as dangerous as we need to be. The rest of the time, we're just people trying to get by, same as anyone else. The Helvian had nodded, accepting this wisdom from a survivor of impossible odds. And the conversation moved on to exam questions and study strategies and all the normal concerns of students everywhere. Nobody noticed the slight emphasis she'd put on the phrase, "as we need to be," or the way her eyes had flickered briefly to something distant when she said it. Nobody connected it to 5 missing hunters who'd learned too late what it meant to hunt an apex predator from Earth. The galaxy continued to turn. Civilized species continued to live their safe lives on their safe worlds. And humans continued to be that strange, scary anomaly that everyone was glad stayed mostly on their quarantined death world. The Academy updated its recruitment materials to emphasize their commitment to safety and student well-being. The kind of PR move that sounded good and meant nothing. And in the archive sub-level of the library, the climate control systems continued their eternal work, preserving materials for future generations of scholars, maintaining perfect conditions for long-term storage, running exactly as designed, with no errors, no malfunctions, no indication that anything was anything other than perfectly, completely, utterly normal. Which just goes to show that the most dangerous thing about Deathworld species isn't their strength or their speed, or their endurance or their ridiculous ability to survive things that should definitely kill them. It's their capacity for problem-solving, their talent for adaptation, their tendency to look at an impossible situation and figure out not just how to survive it, but how to make sure it never becomes a problem again. The hunters had come after class, thinking they'd found easy prey, thinking a human would be a trophy worth taking. The Deathworld girl had struck back, killed them all, and erased the proof. And then she'd gone back to studying for her midterms, because surviving was one thing. But she hadn't come all the way to an alien academy just to fail xenobiology. Priorities, after all, were what separated civilized beings from mere survivors, though in her case, being both was working out just fine.